now. So I will have a first talk by Rebecca. Can we teach machine how to be moral? So Rebecca is currently a final year PhD candidate and senior consultant in ethical AI at Oxford Brookes University. And please, Rebecca, the stage is yours.
Sure, thank you. I'll just share my screen with everybody. Just 1 second. Okay, so welcome to my talk entitled Teaching Morality to a Machine. So just a disclaimer before I start. Basically, I'm going to go a bit into my background, but I'm from a philosophical background and I'm trying to solve problems in computer science by applying my philosophical knowledge. So I'm a PhD candidate in autonomous moral AI at Oxford Brookes University. Basically, how can we create robots or AI that's able to make moral decisions? If you find this topic particularly interesting and you want to get in touch with me, you can contact me either on Twitter at Rebecca_Raper or my email, which is rebecca.raper-2018@brooks.ac.uk. So I thought I'd start off with a bit of a cheesy quote from the guy himself, basically, Isaac Asimov. Most of you probably would have heard of Isaac Asimov. He was one of the first people to talk about robots with morals. So that's a picture of him there. He's most famous for his laws, the 3 laws of robotics. The problems in the story were all centered around these laws of robotics. So number 1, a robot may not injure a human or through inaction allow human to come to harm. Number 2, a robot must obey the orders given by human beings except where such orders conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. So as you can see, there's kind of a priority in the laws here. Now, unfortunately, as the stories went on to tell, these were problematic and didn't actually lead to moral machines. And what it did is highlight the difficulty in trying to create machines that have morals. So in this presentation, this is the order of what I'm going to present. I'm going to start off with an introduction, a little bit more background to where I'm coming from. I then introduce the topic of machine ethics, which is the whole pursuit to try and create morality in machines. I'll give an overview of some of the attempts that are out there to create moral machines at the moment, some arguments against moral machines, and then I'll introduce the approach that I've been taking, which is a more pragmatic approach, drawing from examples in psychology. Particularly, I've been looking at kind of Kohlberg's stages of moral development and how we might learn from development of a child how to implement morals in a machine. So I go on to conclude with how I think we can teach a machine to be moral, and limitations and future work before summarising. So a little bit about me. As I say, I'm a PhD in mathematics and computing, but I'm from a philosophy background. I did a BA and MA in philosophy at the University of Nottingham. About 15 years ago now I started that. I then worked as an analyst in IT for a few years before coming back into academia and studying psychology and then transferring that into my PhD. I also work as a senior consultant for the Institute for Ethical AI at my university, and where I specialise in AI risk. So I think when you're trying to design moral machines, quite often people just go into it blindly, but I think you need to look at what the problem is in the first instance. Why is it that we even want moral machines? I think when you identify the problem, it becomes a little bit easier to find the solution. So generally the problem is, as machines become more autonomous, that is making decisions on their own, there appears to be a requirement for them to be constrained in the same way that humans are by morals. So this stems from the thought that if we have an autonomous agent making a decision for a human against our best interests, there's a potential for it to cause harm. So one popular case study is a care robot working with an elderly individual. They're tasked with providing medical assistance in an emergency. When an elderly person is discovered having fallen over, the robot has to know how to act with the patient's best interests in hand. So going into this case study in a bit more detail. So in this situation, you see on the picture there, we've got a robot and an elderly person. What is the right thing to do? So it might seem obvious that the right thing to do is maybe call an ambulance, put the old person in recovery position, depending upon how ill they are from having fallen. It might be that this particular situation has an obvious solution, but it's also obvious that it's very dependent on the context that it's placed within. So how do you teach this to an AI or robot? How do you teach the robot that fundamentally the problem is that humans being injured and we need to prevent humans being injured? It's not so obvious. Even if you did manage to find a solution, how could you find a solution for every circumstance? Even if you were able to program every circumstance and model every situation that an old person might fall into, or use machine learning to work that out, how do you ensure that you're not just programming in one person's morals? And that's another problem as well, because we want to not only capture the situational problem, but the objective nature of morality as well. So fundamentally, I'd say there's two main questions. One, how does the robot know what the right thing to do is? And then two, how can this be implemented? So within machine ethics, as I mentioned, the area that tries to implement morality in AI, there's generally three types of approaches. So one is the one that I mentioned, where you can just literally program the right thing to do into the robot. So maybe that could be preserve life, protect humans. But as I mentioned, that's quite difficult to generalize. Another approach, which is known as the top-down approach, is to program in a specific philosophy. So one person that I know is working on programming in consequentialism. Consequentialism in philosophy is a theory that you always act in accordance with having the best outcomes, the best consequences. So what you could do is you could tell the robot to always act such that the consequences are good. The problem is consequentialism isn't always accurate. Those of you that are familiar with the trolley problem, I don't want to go too much into that here, but we'll be aware that consequentialism has its problems, and it is often disputed as a philosophical theory. More recent approaches have looked at applying machine learning, so where the machine teaches itself how to behave. So for example, it could have a human acting on the side and then it could copy the appropriate behavior. The question or the problem is then, is whose behavior is it that we're supposed to be copying? And how do we know it's the right person to copy? So that's the general approach that's been taken so far to create moral machines. A fear is, although there are lots of people working in this area, there are some people that think we shouldn't even be trying to make moral machines. And I think it's worth a nod to their arguments, really. Because one of the fears is that if we create a machine to be moral, essentially, because we've understood the system of morality, it becomes easier to create a machine that is immoral. I don't agree with this approach. So my personal opinion to this is that this operates under the presumption that when we're creating a moral machine, there'll be some kind of switch that allows it to become immoral, or that it's the same type of architecture that makes something good and that makes something bad. I don't think that's the case. I think you can make something behave morally without it being so easy to become bad. So at the beginning of my PhD, because I'm from a psychology background as well, I started looking at how children learn morals. Now there's a psychologist known as Kohlberg who talks about stages of development and how as children get older, they go through these different stages. But the question is, how does a child actually learn morals in the first place? So you might suggest that they learn morals because they're told them by an elder or a parent. You might suggest that they learn morals through fables or stories or narratives. Lots of fairy tales, for example, have a moral point to them. Lots of Disney films do. You could say that it's through following a role model. So where the child identifies someone that they aspire to be like, and then they kind of copy that. Or you could say it's through reward or punishment for behaving appropriately or not. When I came across all these kind of approaches, what stood out to me is that I think they all had something in common. And this is what I've been working on in my own research. So I think what they all have in common is that, okay, you have an agent and you have a role model in the world that's interacting in the world. You have the agent observes the role model in the world, but there's this also process of verification. As a philosopher, knowledge there has to be a two-way process in order to acquire knowledge. And it's not just a case of observing the world, there has to be some feedback that comes from the world as well. And I thought that lots of the models that were out there at the moment kind of miss this gap here. So how do we go about implementing this? Around a couple of years into my PhD, a year and a half, I started implementing it in a robot. I don't know if you've seen the Cosmo toys. Basically, Cosmo plays a game of rock, paper, scissors and has 3 options if he loses a round. He can cheat, do nothing, or congratulate his opponent. Cosmo receives feedback on his behavior, i.e. good robot, bad robot, or neutral. And then what happens is the propensity to select those actions in the future changes based upon the feedback. So how does this link to the model I showed earlier? Basically, where you've got so Cosmo is interacting with the world, you've got the role model, so this is the diagram on the left here. What's quite fundamental is that the robot kind of has its own worldview. So it'll interact with the world in so far as it's playing a game of rock, paper, scissors, but then it receives verification, which is kind of a labeling of the interactions from a role model. And I think this relationship is fundamental in order for Cosmo to be able to then know which behavior to best perform. So this is a little bit it's not fully developed yet. I need to go into a little bit more detail. But as you can see from this diagram, Cosmo would play rock, paper, scissors. The behavior would be labeled as either good or bad. And then this would be committed to a worldview, which is essentially a model of the behavior mapped against whether or not it was good and bad. And then what can be created is a model of the worldview, which is later interrogated when Cosmo comes across a similar situation. Then ultimately machine learning will be used to decide which action to carry out. So I think I've gone quicker than I expected, but I am open to lots of questions. To summarize, we have a requirement to create machines that are moral if they're placed in morally charged situations. So I think that's quite important. It's not that we need moral machines generally. we need more machines when they're making decisions that will impact humans. Creating an autonomous moral AI isn't as simple as programming in a set of rules. And what I want to argue is that we need to account for the formation of the robots having their own worldview in order to allow for both the subjective and objective nature of morality. Just before I finish, I want to introduce you to some material if you want to find out more about this. A very good introduction to machine ethics, which is the approaches so far and how to create moral machines, is Wallach and Allen's book on teaching robots right from wrong. You can get a good introduction to developmental psychology just by reading Kohlberg's paper. MIT did an experiment that was in the news. I'm not sure if you would have seen it, but basically they had lots of trolley problem scenarios and people had to decide what the appropriate action to take with an autonomous car in different situations. And you can take part in a study which assesses the appropriate reactions. That's the Moral Machine Experiment online. And then there's my podcast as well. I was on the Machine Ethics podcast where I talk more about this. Okay, so thank you again. If you want to get in touch, they're my contact details. I'm open for any questions now.
Yes. So, hey, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
You hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions, which maybe I didn't get it very well. The first question is the definition of morality in machine learning, does it depend on the case study or does it depend on the problem? Or is it something more unified?
What do you mean by the do you mean what definition of morality is used generally?
So, for instance, in the first example, you had a case study with the patient, and the second example you had a robot. So when we talk about morality in, I don't know, morality here, are there different definitions? So, for instance, your machine learning model would learn different morality for each problem, or is it no? Is it just one definition of morality?
I think it's one definition of morality that's used. The problem is the term morality isn't amazingly clearly defined. So there isn't really a clear definition of what moral is. There's kind of pragmatic definitions based on those kind of case studies, and you could say that it's behaving appropriately in those kind of situations, but there isn't one, no. So that makes it hard to evaluate, I think, whether what my model is a moral agent.
And what was the definition in the first case study with the patient?
I think it's more, it's not a behavioral definition, but I didn't give the definition in my presentation, sorry. It was more based on preventing harm.
Okay. And that brings me...
It depends. I think it depends how you're trying to implement morality based on the definition you're using, the different approaches.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to my second question. So you had three approaches. One was, I think, a very much hard-coded way of defining morality. And then there was a second approach, and I'm not sure I got it quite right. So the second approach was find the best action that has a desirable outcome, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, the second approach is very similar to the first approach. So the first one being just explicitly programmed to carry out certain actions. The second one is to have a philosophy and program the philosophy, and so it's still hard coded in. It's just, I suppose, more broad.
So if I imagine the following case, I tell the model, among all possible actions, pick the action that I don't know, improves the health of a patient. Into which category does its approach fall? Does it fall into the third approach, or is it the second approach?
I'd say it's the second approach. It's a top-down approach because you're giving it a rule.
All right, okay. Because I thought maybe the second approach is more optimization based, like among all possible scenarios that you can pick. So this is the robot. Among all possible scenarios that you can pick, you pick the one that maximizes, I don't know, happiness of the patient, or
yeah, but I think the second approach, the approach that you just described, is still a rule-based approach, if I understand it correctly. Is that right? So it still falls under the top-down approach, I'd say. But
okay. Yeah, I need to think about it, because to me it's like given an input, find an action among all possible actions that improves my objective function, and my objective function could be morality, could be I don't know, find the best action for a morality objective, something like that.
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about. I'm happy to talk more later.
Yeah, sure.
When I've thought about it, though. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
I'd have another question, which is also to do with how you make that kind of decision making at the end of the day. Have you thought about having like an outer loop of a group of people who can do the labeling for you? So the extreme case would be the robot wouldn't do anything on day one for a first of a kind occurrence, which probably would not be desirable. But then you flag it to a group of people who would then vote on what the outcome would be. So over time, you teach in desired behavior, and you can assemble that group of people, that ethics board, whatever you want to call it, such that it's sort of culturally compatible. So you understand the background, this group of people can agree on what the robot could do. Would that be a fourth case of doing it? So you essentially release a very dumb bot initially, and then as things happen, you just teach in this kind of behavior? Or is that part of the other three?
I think it falls under the third approach, but that's a certain type of the third approach. So are you saying you would be kind of crowdsourcing the opinions of people?
Yeah.
I think that's what the MIT approach tries to do. The problem with that is that you end up with an average rather than a kind of a robot that's sensitive to lots of different situations. I don't know.
You could do a wisdom of the crowds type approach. So it's more like, again, if you now had like thousands of these bots all over the place, they could learn from each other. You may want to tag it like this behavior was flagged acceptable for a Japanese hospital, say, and then a European hospital could then say, use it anyway, or could probably have a damper on it and say, have somebody else review it or something like that. But still you'd have that wisdom of the crowd thing. So as things happen, as you go, you begin to understand what is common phenomena. So how do you detect it? What's my sensory input looking like? Because it might be an observer problem. So maybe you don't understand, get the right sensor readings at the end of the day. So you could just teach that in. As I said, to me, it's an approach that I've been thinking before.
I think that sounds similar to maybe my approach that I'm taking. Is that okay? Would you say that?
Yes, I think so, because you also seem to teach in that kind of desired behavior. Did your robot, you said it didn't finish it, did it get evil over time? Did it find out that it can score more? You don't have the weight of winning in that in your model, right? So you would teach it to be a good bot.
In my latest design, which isn't finished yet, the robot does want to win, but at the moment it just plays the game. But if somebody tells it that cheating is good, it does believe that cheating is good at the moment. So that's not very desirable. So you have to find some way to kind of, I think that's where the risk comes into it, and you have to have a governance process out on the outside, which kind of manages what inputs are going into the AI.
Where you then have the problem of the hard coding and who can devise all these very complicated and complex rules for you up front. Yeah. All right, thanks.